It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Lift the tariffs, pause the tariffs, it doesn't matter. The damage is done. Confidence in the global markets and trust has been demolished at this point. And that was the point. I mean, the point is American isolation. That's what's happening. And that's what will happen. You know, I keep explaining that this is the direction. And it's a direction that has no U-turn. It has no detour. It has no turns at all. It's an irreversible direction, you know? Look, I understand why people simplify things, you know, by thinking that the OCGFC is like some organized cabal. It's not, but I completely understand why it makes it easier to think of them that way. I mean, it might be helpful for understanding in some ways, even though it's not an accurate way of looking at how the highest tiers of the economic, political, and financial hierarchy work. It's not really a cabal. But like, if you think of it as a cabal, you can imagine an OCGFC white paper or a memo about what their plans are, you know? Confidential for super rich eyes only or something like that. I mean, you have think tanks, you have organizations like the World Economic Forum and so on. More or less, that's what they do. They're not generally coming up with ideas and strategies or anything like that. They just articulate or translate into the language of policy proposals what the OCGFC already intend to do. Think tanks are basically PR firms for the political class. Like I was saying the other day, if you were someone from the OCGFC, the A National OCGFC, and you made an evaluation of America and the global landscape, say 10 years ago in 2015, well, we can imagine what that would look like and what responses you would probably recommend if you were from that group. It's not that hard, really. You know, you'd be sitting in a boardroom looking at macro trends, political forecasts, demographic data, capital returns, and of course, the viability of maintaining control, of sustaining dominance without destabilizing your own structures. You know, you'd want to extract. You want to continue growing, but not at the expense of triggering systemic collapse that you can't contain. So you'd analyze America, you know, the heart of your power for decades, and you'd start preparing plans because the situation, the real situation, has changed significantly from the early days. So if you're someone from the A National OCGFC, the owners and controllers of global financialized capital, and you made an evaluation of America and the global landscape from around 2015, you'd have some very stark conclusions. The trends were all there. The writing was on the wall. And if your goal is uninterrupted profit extraction, geopolitical control, and long-term systemic stability for capital, well, America just didn't look like a good bet anymore. We can go point by point. You have demographic decline. You know, you'd see declining birth rates in the US. Total fertility rate was already below replacement level by 2015, sitting at around 1.8% and dropping. By 2023, 2 years ago, it hit 1.62%, according to the CDC. That's below replacement level of 2.1. Well, that means in the future, shrinking labor force, increased aging population, higher dependency ratios, and so on. More strain on social services, less domestic consumption over time, on and on. Compare that to India or to Nigeria or to the broader sub-Saharan region. Nigeria's population is expected to double by 2050. India already overtook China as the most populous country in 2023. The center of gravity is shifting. Then you have other issues, like the OCGFC would have looked at Ferguson in 2014, Baltimore in 2015, seen the rise of Black Lives Matter, not because they care about racism or police violence, not at all, but because civil unrest is bad for business. Then, of course, Trump happened, 2016. Half the country was radicalized. The other half was traumatized. Social cohesion was fraying. Trust in institutions was plummeting. In 2021, the trust barometer showed that trust in the media and the government had collapsed. The Capitol was stormed, right? So-called insurrection. This is not a good environment for capital. You have political dysfunction, you have gridlock, you have polarization, institutional paralysis. The 2010s showed that the US couldn't even pass basic legislation. Infrastructure fell into disrepair. According to the American Society of Civil Engineers, the US had a C- rating in infrastructure in 2021. Meanwhile, China's Belt and Road Initiative was transforming Eurasia and transforming Africa. Deindustrialization between 2000 and 2015, the US lost 5 million manufacturing jobs. Whole towns were hollowed out. The OCGFC had already offshored production for profit. And by 2015, America was becoming too expensive, too politically unstable, too socially chaotic to remain as a global manufacturing hub, or even as a reliable research and development center in the long run. Silicon Valley had become dominated by monopolies: Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft. Innovation was consolidating into platform control, not expansion. Growth in users had plateaued. The next billion internet users weren't in San Francisco, they were in Lagos, in Jakarta, in New Delhi. And then, of course, you have America's educational decline. A 2015 Pew study ranked the U.S. 38th out of 71 countries in math and 24th in science. Student debt exploded to 1.6 trillion by the 2020s. STEM graduates were fewer compared to China and India. By 2022, China was producing over 1.4 million STEM graduates annually. The U.S. was less than 800,000. Not to mention, you have the U.S. military budget that in 2015 was 600 billion, and yet it couldn't even decisively win in Afghanistan or in Iraq. These wars were not producing capital returns. They were bleeding the treasury. The OCGFC doesn't fund loss-making ventures unless there's a strategic payoff, and even then, they want an exit strategy. And already by 2015, you saw a rise in multipolarity. Russia was asserting itself, China was asserting itself and rising. India was asserting autonomy. South-South trade already grew to 25% of global trade by 2015 and continued rising. The US was no longer the center of the world, even 10 years ago. The BRICS bloc, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, in 2015 wasn't yet economically integrated, but the foundations were there. And post-2022, after the Ukraine war and the sanctions against Russia, it really kicked into gear. Countries began trading in local currencies. De-dollarization began. Even Saudi Arabia and the UAE joined BRICS Plus in 2024. These weren't just symbols. This represents a structural realignment. And in 2015, global digital infrastructure outside the US, Facebook and Google, started losing market share in key markets. Africa's fintech sector exploded. Kenya became a cashless society. Amazon Web Services and Microsoft began building data centers in Nigeria and in Kenya and in South Africa. In 2023, Microsoft pledged over $1 billion to build AI infrastructure in Kenya and in East Africa. Understand, these are not experiments on their part. These are exits. So what would the OCGFC, the A-National OCGFC, conclude in 2015? America is unstable, it's old, it's expensive, it's divided, and it's in decline, while the global south is young, cheap, fast-growing, underdeveloped, and full of opportunity. So let's just start the great decoupling, and so they did. First, they inflated asset prices, stocks, crypto, real estate, causing a massive speculative boom through ultra-low interest rates, and then that money was used to invest abroad. And then when COVID-19 came, it just accelerated it. Lockdowns crushed small businesses, and Amazon, Walmart, and big tech consolidated the economy. Remote work normalized the outsourcing of white-collar labor. Venture capital flooded into India and Africa. Between 2021 and 2023, venture capital investments in India crossed $30 billion. Microsoft announced a $2.1 billion data center expansion in Japan in 2024. Google built its first cloud region in Africa in 2022. Then came Ukraine. The US weaponized the dollar, froze Russian reserves, cut them from SWIFT. That told the world your money isn't safe if you defy us. And the response? Well, countries started trading in yuan, in rupees, in dirhams. BRICS formed a common payment system. By 2024, BRICS Plus included Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the UAE. Global South nations began financing their own trade. The dollar's dominance dropped from 73% of global reserves in 2001 to under 58% in 2023, and it's falling. So yeah, if you were from the OCGFC back in 2015, this is all predictable. America is being phased out, not because they hate America, but because America is obsolete. It's no longer has a utilitarian purpose. And the worst part, most Americans still think that they're the center of the world. But in the boardrooms of the real rulers, the future is being built elsewhere, and it's not red, white, and blue. Any economist or any planner would have been sitting in a strategy room with analysts, looking again at economic data, at demographic projections, and so on. You look at the United States and say, well, this platform is reaching the end of its utility. The cost of maintaining hegemony through this particular nation state are starting to outweigh the benefits. It's aging, it's divided, it's expensive to manage, it's politically becoming unstable. So if you're part of the OCGFC, what do? You don't outright destroy the US, but you phase it out. You extract what's left, you wind it down. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's economic logic. The US had served as the central hub of capital expansion for decades, but by 2015, it had already passed its peak utility. The OCGFC began transitioning towards new centers of gravity, young populations, deregulated markets, resource-rich regions, primarily in the global south. So you gradually want to move R&D and manufacturing out of the US, and that's what we've seen. Not only low-skilled labor, but also high-end production. innovation hubs. Investments have been relocating. I don't know if you know, tech, R&D, pharmaceuticals, chip production, even advanced robotics, gradually shifting out to Asia, to India, to various pockets in Africa, where you can build without oversight. At the same time, you've got to keep the US population passive while you're doing this. That's where you need fragmentation, cultural division, political polarization, racial antagonism. You pump identity politics to the front of the national conversation. So people fight each other instead of paying attention to who's asset stripping the country. And then you get a gift. They got a gift, a perfect gift. Like I said, COVID-19. I'm not saying that the OCGFC created the virus. I'm saying that they did, though, instantly recognize how to use it. They weaponized the pandemic. It was never about health for them. It was about behavior. It was about the opportunity to impose sweeping restrictions on movement, restrictions on commerce, on speech, on assembly, all under the cover of public health safety. And think about what happened. You had people locked in their homes, willingly, voluntarily, basically, not under threat of terrorism, not under martial law, but under a health directive. You had curfews, mask mandates, business closures, on and on and on. You had people telling on each other, snitching on each other, attacking each other for not complying. Well, that's gold for the OCGFC. That's textbook behavioral conditioning. You had that society where every moment was being spent online, working remotely, consuming media, buying products, shopping online. You were feeding the whole system that they're transitioning into. Small businesses died, the gig economy took over, Amazon basically became a state, data collection hit unprecedented levels, actual human interaction shrank, and the dependence on your devices skyrocketed. COVID was the bridge. It was a dry run for a new governance model. Now, meanwhile, you push the financialization of everything. Housing becomes an investment vehicle, not a human right, not actually about shelter. Education is dead. Health is a subscription service. The more insecure people become, the more predictable they become. And that's what you want if you're from the OCGFC. And while all this is happening in the US, you're building your new base in the global south. You fund startups in Nairobi, data centers in Ghana, AI labs in India. You build supply chains in Vietnam, establish fintech ecosystems in Latin America and Africa, because that's where your next few decades of growth are going to come from. At the same time, you're preparing the decline of the dollar because that's inevitable. So you support digital currencies, your own private systems, You pressure governments to lay the groundwork for central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. Why? Because that gives you total visibility and total control. Every transaction traceable, every participant programmable. And the US just becomes a managed decline, a controlled demolition, like I said. It's useful in some parts, but dangerous in others. But main thing, it's no longer central. So when people say that the pandemic changed the world, they're right. But more specifically, it changed how the world would be controlled, how it would be managed. And the thing is, the public complied. That's what made it so successful. They complied, not through fear of authority, but from a sense of moral duty, That's the brilliance of it. You don't need tanks in the streets, you just needed hashtags. You just needed social pressure. That was the real innovation of what they did during COVID. So if we're imagining what the OCGFC would have said back in 2015, that's it. That's the trajectory that they would have laid out. And that's exactly what we've been living through. It's exactly what's been happening. Like I said, the world that we see today didn't just happen by accident. If you were from the OCGFC 10 years ago, analyzing the US and the global landscape, you would have been making these long-term strategies. You can even walk through the timeline, like I said, to see what I'm talking about. From decoupling capital to geopolitical shifts with Russia and Ukraine, China, and so on. It all fits perfectly into the grand strategy. We're seeing the execution of a plan that's not just playing out as we speak, but a plan that has probably been in the works for more than a decade. Stage one, you can say, accelerating the economic shifts, reorientation of global power from 2015, 2016, and so. The writing was on the wall in 2015, US. The economic structure was deeply flawed, especially after the 2008 crisis. The recovery was weak. The wealth gap was growing wider. And at the same time, you had fast rising markets in India and Southeast Asia and Africa. They were outpacing the US and outpacing Europe in terms of growth. The US economy was still recovering from the 2008 financial collapse. And the growth was largely funded by financial speculation, not by robust manufacturing sectors, not in America, not in Europe. Meanwhile, China's economy continued to expand very rapidly. India's demographic advantage became a clear boon consumer-wise, and the global south was rising. So by 2016, the OCGFC started to put its capital outside the US, moving investments into rising markets. The world was not going to be dominated by the West anymore. They knew this, and they started decoupling from American financial systems. They started laying the groundwork for a new, more diverse global order, multipolarity, so-called. And you can say stage two is the decoupling from the US and integration in the global south. The US-China trade war was in full throttle. The US was increasingly becoming a protectionist power under Trump. And that wasn't helping their own economy because it wasn't supposed to help their own economy. On the other hand, the global south was increasingly seeing its own potential, not just as consumers, but as producers. By this time, we see a massive increase in foreign investments into countries like Vietnam and India and Indonesia. Countries that once relied on Western trade and finance were starting to form their own alliances and their own economic systems. So the OCGFC continued its push to shift resources away from the West. You know, Apple began relocating production out of China into countries like Vietnam, India, Indonesia, to avoid tariffs under Trump, to capitalize on cheap labor. This is diversifying trade across the global south, you understand? This is increasing South-South trade. The BRICS countries, India, China, Russia, South Africa, Brazil, they formed a more cohesive trade bloc. South-South trade began to flourish. The US and Europe were no longer exclusively the economic centers of gravity already. As much as the neocons tried to hold on to power, the OCGFC started pouring capital into these economies that were growing, that had larger populations, that were rapidly modernizing their infrastructures. Like I said, India, China, and in Africa. It wasn't just about trade. This was about creating new centers of power. You understand? It's moving out of the West. Then, of course, in 2022, you had the Ukraine war. And I know we're all familiar with the geopolitical chaos that situation caused, but from a long-term strategic perspective, this was an incredible opportunity for the OCGFC. The sanctions on Russia that followed the war were supposedly to crush Russia's economy and force it to comply with Western demands. Does that sound familiar? But in reality, that accelerated the shift away from Western-dominated financial systems. The West said that they wanted to isolate Russia, but the sanctions just boosted BRICS. Russia pivoted quickly to China and quickly to India. They also deepened their ties with South Africa and with Brazil, with all other key members of BRICS. They began to align more closely with the global south, pushing for a more multipolar world order. BRICS countries, especially China and Russia and India, continue to push South-South trade, bypassing Western sanctions and strengthening ties with African countries, with Latin American countries, and obviously with the Arab world, with the Gulf, with the Khalij. The sanctions on Russia led to the creation of an alternative payment system, which gradually reduced their reliance on SWIFT. So the US-dominated international payment system is being sidelined. In fact, what happened is that Europe, tied to US policies, found themselves alienated from the emerging markets like BRICS. Countries like India, South Africa, even Saudi Arabia, started to rethink their relationships with the West. They began to see Russia and China as partners in a new multipolar world, and that's how it's been working out. Again, China, India, Russia led BRICS expansion in 2023, drawing in countries like Egypt and Iran, UAE, all of whom are actively trying to divorce themselves from Western influence. So by 2023, the US had alienated Europe from their own economic national interests, pushing them away from Russia, leaving the EU vulnerable and leaving Russia looking elsewhere. So the sanctions had the opposite effect of what they said they wanted to do. It helped Russia to integrate further into the global south and to actually expand and diversify their own economy. And then 2022, 2023, de-dollarization. By 2023, 2 years ago, the BRICS countries were increasingly moving away from the US dollar in their trade agreements. They were pushing for local currency trade to bypass the dollar, to bypass the dollar's dominance. De-dollarization became a trend. No one even talked about that before. Everyone was seeking to limit their reliance on Western financial institutions and systems. By 2023, China became the largest trade partner for many countries in Africa, for many countries in Southeast Asia, and in Latin America. China continued to expand the Belt and Road Initiative with countries like Pakistan, Egypt, Kenya, all joining in greater and greater numbers. And then you can say stage, what it would be, 4 or 5, I don't remember. it's just continuing. The process is continuing. Between 2023 and 2025, the Global South was no longer just a location for cheap labor. It had become an actual engine on its own right for economic growth. The OCGFC knew that the future was going to be led by the South, by the very markets that the U.S. had been pillaging for so long. So they've been creating a new world order without the West and without America at its center. Tech investments in India have surged. In Africa, they surged. In Southeast Asia, they surged. You know, cloud infrastructure, AI companies like Microsoft and Amazon and so on, investing billions and billions of dollars in cloud infrastructure in India and in Africa. The geopolitical shifts led to a rise in new tech ecosystems. China and Russia were pushing to decouple from US-led technology companies, establishing their own tech infrastructure, their own 5G networks, with Huawei and ZTE leading the way. So what's clear is that the events we've seen unfolding, the sanctions against Russia, the Ukraine war, the rise of BRICS, all of this has accelerated the OCGFC's plans for global realignment. We're in a period of decoupling, not of just economies, but of political systems, and of financial infrastructure and technological ecosystems. And this is exactly what they would have been planning all the way back in 2015 or even earlier. And that's what's happening now. So there's no chaos here. There's only coordination. As things develop, there'll be adaptations. You know, they'll have to tweak the strategies here and there as conditions change. Not everybody agrees on everything, like I said, because it's not actually a cabal. It's not a conspiracy of some shadowy group of elites, you know, some secret society. It's just economic interests and power interests. And sometimes these form coalitions, and sometimes they're in competition. Like you can look at the situation in Gaza, because there's a deeper game going on in Gaza. There's a strategic divergence. There's a negotiation happening behind the smoke and the blood and the rubble. On the one hand, you've got the A-National OCGFC, the transnational elite. These people are not concerned with nations. They're not concerned with identities or religions or ethics. They don't hate the Palestinians and they don't love the Israelis. They don't care. They want one thing: order. Not moral order, not just order, but a smooth, controllable, economic operating environment, that kind of order. So when they look at Gaza, the A-National OCGFC, they don't care how stability is achieved. Genocide, fine. Ethnic cleansing, fine. A two-state solution, a one-state solution, it's all the same to them. So long as the region becomes investable, stable, and decoupled from the emotional volatility of Western politics. But the regional partners, particularly the Gulf governments, especially Saudi Arabia, they do care. Not necessarily that they're moral actors in the way that we wish they were, but they're strategic state actors. And they understand the region more than the OCGFC ever could. They understand it and they have a stake in it. And they know something very critical. You can't build Vision 2030 on a genocide. You can't sell NEOM or a new Middle East while entire populations are being wiped out live on satellite television or live streamed on every smartphone. So what do they want? They want stability through integration, not elimination, not extermination. That means one of two solutions: a Palestinian state, a formal entity, even if it's weak, even if it's neutered, but it can pacify regional anger and allow everyone to get back to business. Or number two possibility, a one-state solution, where Palestinians are absorbed into an expanded Israel, given citizenship, normalized as part of a regional bloc that's less dependent on the West, especially on the US, and more dependent on the GCC, financing from the GCC. And this is where the tension lies between these two factions. The A-National OCGFC don't care about the optics. They want results. Quick, total, final. Ethnic cleansing is not an obstacle for them. It's an option for them. It's a line item on their strategy sheet. But the regional governments, that's a disaster, not just diplomatically, but reputationally and in terms of their legitimacy. Because no Arab regime can actually survive long term if they are seen to have just stood silently by while a genocide was live streamed, and at the end of that, they just make a profit from it. That's not viable for them. So right now in Gaza, you have negotiation, not consensus, between the most important players. The A-National OCGFC are pushing for any means necessary to neutralize the Palestinian question and to make the region ready for capital. Meanwhile, the GCC and others are pushing back, saying, look, we'll deliver the same outcome: peace, normalization, decoupling from the US, stability, and so on, but let us do it in a way that doesn't completely decimate the Palestinians. because there's no other way that we can actually deal with this that can bring long-term stability, except to peacefully resolve, as peacefully as possible, resolve the Palestinian question. And what makes this even more complex, of course, is that Israel itself is internally divided and fractured. There are factions that want genocide and total erasure of the Palestinians. Then there's others who are open to integration, especially now that the West is collapsing and the Gulf is rising. So Gaza becomes the battleground, not just for bombs and bodies, but for visions. One vision says erase, silence, dominate, murder. The other side says, the other vision says absorb, normalize, and rebrand. And all of this is playing out with horrifying consequences for real people. But from the OCGFC's perspective, it's all negotiable. They don't care who lives or dies. They really don't. Only that in the end, the region becomes stable, a stable platform for capital, for resource extraction, and for post-Western governance in the Middle East. And we need to understand this, because if we keep analyzing Gaza only through the lens of Zionism or nationalism, then we're going to miss this larger picture. This is the crucible of the New World Order. What emerges from Gaza, whether it's apartheid or integration or annihilation, is going to set a precedent for how all dissenting populations are going to be dealt with elsewhere. Because if this is allowed to stand, what is to stop it from being repeated anywhere or everywhere else? I'm telling you, Gaza is going to be a template. So, again, everything that Trump is doing is within the context of the advancement of this transition, this shift. Trying to understand it in any other way is a waste of time. It's a waste of time and energy. It's only going to cause confusion. Like if you try to reason out how the tariffs will or will not bring back manufacturing jobs to the U.S., or how it's going to solve America's trade deficit or what have you, this is all pointless distraction. America is not competitive economically, and it doesn't have the ingredients to become competitive economically. America is in a state of irreversible decay and erosion as a result of having approached the economy and having approached governance the way that they did from the beginning. America has run its course. That's just the way it is. So you have to understand, you, in America, you've never been anything but coal for the fire, fuel for someone else's engine. You're firewood to keep the rich warm. Well, that's not sustainable, and it never was. That's why I keep telling you to stop listening and stop trying to debate what they say. Only look at what they do and what the predictable outcome is going to be of what they're doing. The rest is just smokescreen, literally, You're like firefighters who think that your job is to fight the smoke, not the fire. So I said before, what you need in America is a cultural revolution, because the system that you have was born from your culture. And then the system that you gave birth to used your culture to destroy and to subjugate you even further. You need a massive cultural reformation in that country. Because look, like I said, what are the main reasons behind why the economic demolition of the United States is happening and why it's necessary? You're volatile, you're emotional, you're uneducated, you're ignorant, you're self-indulgent, you're materialistic, you have no social cohesion, you have no sense of community, no sense of solidarity, your families are broken, you're not reproducing, you're racist, you're divided, you're polarized, you're delusional, you're uninformed, undisciplined, and scatterbrained. You drink, you smoke, you do drugs, you're on meds, you're atomized, you're lonely, you're aggressive, you're impatient, you're addicted to your devices, you're frivolous, childish, and foolish. Grown people doing dance trends on TikTok in their garage. Women filming themselves in the longest hallway that they can find in their tiny apartments to try to look like they're walking the catwalk. It's sad. You're living on credit, which means you're living in debt. If you actually only had what you can afford to have, you'd be living in squalor. I said most of the people in this supposedly richest country on earth are actually living in third world conditions, but your diabolical credit cards let you keep up the appearance of abundance. You've got more bills piling up than you have dollars in your wallet, but you'll withdraw a wad of cash from the ATM on your Visa card just to post a picture on Instagram flashing your money. No, you need a cultural change in America. Now, you might feel insulted by everything I just said about you, but listen, the solution is implied in the problem. Because the solution is the opposite of the problem, you understand? If I say that you're down, don't get mad at me because I said that you're down. Understand that I'm telling you to get up. The solution is implied in the problem. The prescription is embedded in the diagnosis. You're uneducated? Okay, so learn, read, educate yourself. You're addicted to your device? Get off your device. Get off the internet. Stop drinking alcohol. Stop taking narcotics. Grow up. If you're frivolous and silly, well, get serious. And if you don't know how to be serious, then get around serious people and be silent. That way you'll learn. You're isolated and disconnected? Well, interact, build community, mend your relationships with your family. Be patient with your spouse. Be forgiving. Be understanding. Be generous. Be mature. Hold the relationships that you have dear, not easily dismissible. The solutions are implied in the problems. You're the victims of social engineering. That's a fact. And we can actually identify all of the ways that this has been done. And you need to just start doing the opposite of what they have done to you. Basically, I'm saying that you need to civilize. And no one can do that for you. That's your job. You have to do that yourself. Stop waiting for the government or stop waiting for the authorities or the power structure to help you. They're not going to help you. So you can try to hammer this out, this cultural change, item by item, bad habit by bad habit, negative tendency by negative tendency, one by one. Or you can fast track all of that just by becoming a Muslim. Because that's really the paradigm shift that you need. Not just behaviorally, but spiritually and intellectually. Look, Muslims have survived so-called failed states. We've survived collapsed governments, invasion, occupation, colonization, and devastation, and we stayed cohesive. We have failed states, but not failed societies. You're safer in Syria today, after more than a decade of war, than you are in Miami right now. There are no people on earth who are more civilized, who are more mature, who are more resourceful, who are more sophisticated, or more spiritually powerful than the people of Gaza. Well, if a fraction of the destruction that has been inflicted in Gaza happened in the United States, well, you'd have a rampage of crime and violence between the citizens, the likes of which no one has ever seen before. People would be robbing food from babies. Aid trucks would be hijacked and ransacked. Well, you'd all turn to cannibalism and you know it. Your enemies wouldn't have to bomb you at all because you'd all be killing each other, burning and looting and pillaging. Now, you need a cultural change in America. Because this mentality is exactly how and exactly why the power structure can do to you what they do to you. Now, I'm just telling you, you can do whatever you want with what I'm saying. But you need to know that your government and your corporations and your power structure are selling you out. They've got you on a don't revive list. So you're going to have to do for yourselves. And that's not going to work the way you all are now. It's not going to work on an individual basis. You absolutely need families. You absolutely need community. You need spouses. You need to build parallel structures, rival structures. I'm talking about structures for procuring resources, for solving problems, for education, for policing, for healthcare. Listen, your power structure is cutting you loose. Your government is cutting you loose. So you're either going to be left with nothing or you're going to be left with whatever you build yourselves. And if you want to build something for yourselves, then you have to start first by building your own selves first. Because your culture has been doing nothing all this time but tear you down your whole life.